is Decoding Learning Differences with Kimberlyn Lavelle, and this episode is Diagnosing Dyslexia. So, in this episode, we're going to be going over the diagnosis of dyslexia, how to get a diagnosis of dyslexia, whether or not you need a diagnosis of dyslexia to work with your child. And I apologize because I already did this video, but apparently my voice was not recorded at all. So I'm just like talking to a screen and all you can see is my face moving and my lips moving and no sound is coming out. So we're trying again. Okay, so I see parents ask about this. I've heard parents ask about this. The school report just says specific learning disability. How do I get a diagnosis of dyslexia? Why won't they call it dyslexia? They refuse to put dyslexia on it. I already paid for this other diagnosis and they won't put it on the report and all these things. I hear all these things. So, yes, the school report just says specific learning disability. And yes, it could say dyslexia. There was a time in which you couldn't put dyslexia on the school stuff. And then you could, but nobody knew that you could, which is basically where we're at now. And it does, I think, vary a little bit by state. So parents want to know, like, it says specific learning disability. How do I get my child diagnosed with dyslexia? Okay, that's the problem, really, is that you're asking for a diagnosis. A school in most states is not allowed to diagnose anything. Now, the school will do the exact same tests that medical professionals, neuropsychs, whoever they're doing to get for those people to reach a diagnosis, but the school is not allowed to give a diagnosis. So if you look at the report, you can read between the lines and get that diagnosis. But for various reasons, schools don't diagnose. The school's role is to determine whether or not a child qualifies for an individualized education plan or a 504. Whether or not they qualify. So a school has to offer FAPE, free and appropriate public education. They need to know whether or not your child needs something so that they can provide FAPE. So let's talk a little bit. You can get a diagnosis for your child. Private practice. Some people recommend that you ask for an independent educational evaluation because then the school district is paying for that private evaluation. I definitely understand why people recommend this. Keep in mind, schools are underfunded. If it's not necessary for your child to get the IEP, if the IEP is solid, you agree with everything on it, I would encourage you to not ask for an independent educational evaluation, because the point of the IEE, independent educational evaluation, is not to get an official diagnosis. The point of it is to get a better understanding of what's happening with your child so that you have a more appropriate IEP. If you already have an appropriate IEP, if everyone's already on the same page, they already did all the testing, they basically have the diagnosis, they just can't give it to you. Like legally, they can't say. And that same person with all those same tests, if they were private practice, they could give the diagnosis. You have it. You have to just accept it. It might not be official in terms of there wasn't someone who said, your child has dyslexia. But if you read between the lines, it's there. I would encourage you not to make the district pay for an evaluation that could be better used actually providing services for your child and others. Schools are underfunded. Okay. So some people, their issue with specific learning disability is understandable. They're like, it's vague. What does that mean? Well, yeah, but what does dyslexia mean? Like, you think it means something, but do you even know what it means? And I'm not trying to be mean about this. What I'm saying here is, yes, specific learning disability is vague. It's like, well, what is the specific disability? But keep reading. Not everywhere. I've seen really bad reports that confuse me. In most reports, it will say specific learning disability in reading. And that is the equivalent to dyslexia, or specific learning disability in reading and writing, or specific learning disability in basic reading skills, something like that. All of those are saying dyslexia. Now, what is the cause of that disability? That's where, so some people say that dyslexia is a phonological processing disorder. That is the most common type of dyslexia. Some people believe that's the only kind. Some people will separate out all these different kinds. And that's where you're really getting that same thing with specific learning disability, where there's all these different processes that they evaluate for. Does your child have phonological processing disorder, auditory processing disorder, visual processing disorder, cognitive processing disorder, attention processing disorder, a language processing disorder, a sensory motor processing? Those disorders are explaining where the disability in reading is coming from, what's causing the disability in reading. So the same thing, like you get types of dyslexia where they'll say that a child has a certain type of dyslexia, and different people call it different things, and there's arguments about this. It's like, the point is, what is actually happening in your child's brain? What kind of instruction does your child need? What can you expect from your child? If they have poor working memory, you know certain types of things are going to be more difficult and that you need to do things to work on their working memory. If your child has poor phonological processing, you know that's an area that they're going to struggle with and you need to work on that. If your child has fluency issues, well, then often, not necessarily 100% of the time, but often it's because the part of their brain that is supposed to store and retrieve letter sound correspondences, and up to 3 letters making a single sound, the part of the brain that's supposed to store that isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing. It doesn't work correctly, and it's being compensated for on the other side of the brain. I might be mixing up which goes where. But it's being compensated for by the other side of the brain, which means it literally takes longer for the neural networks to connect to get to the answer for your child to read. Your child will always be slower. You can solidify all of that. You can make sure they know everything. But there is a point at which the brain neural networks just is not, there will be like a plateau where they just can't get faster because their brain is arranged in a different way. Okay, I hope that was not offensive. So we need to know what type of dyslexia. We don't need to know, and within that, we really just need to know what is happening. What do the different tests say? Like, I don't even care about any of the titles. I really want to see the real report because I want to see what scores your child has in which area and what kinds of things I can expect from them, what kinds of, the positives and negatives. What can I expect when I'm working with them? Okay. Whew. So we've talked about this. Dyslexia really is just, it's often, okay, here. So dyslexia can be defined as a general term for disorders that involve difficulty in learning to read or interpret words, letters, and other symbols, but that do not affect general intelligence. That's in the Oxford Dictionary. The International Dyslexia Association definition, which is the one I see quoted most often, dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. But there, at the very beginning, dyslexia is a specific learning disability. So when the school is putting that, you have your answer. The DSM-5 specific learning disorder with impairment in reading includes possible deficits in word reading accuracy, reading rate or fluency, reading comprehension. And in there's a note. Dyslexia is an alternative term used to refer to a pattern of learning difficulties characterized by problems with accurate or fluent word recognition, poor decoding, and poor spelling abilities. So when you're reading that your child has a specific learning disability in reading, you are reading that your child has dyslexia, essentially. So does a diagnosis matter? Is there any reason to get an actual official diagnosis? Not usually. Like I said, we mostly just need to know what we need to know to teach your child. What do I need to know so that your child can actually make progress? I need to know what they know. I need to know what their deficits are in. I need to know how their brain is processing information. I need to know some things. But once I have that, I don't care what label you give it. The thing you need is this type of testing with whichever label they put on it when your child is going into college to make sure that they get accommodations in college. They need that evaluation to have been done relatively recently, within the past 3 years before the school, before college. So, yes. It matters, but not really. Not really. Okay. Doesn't matter. So, your takeaway for today. Dyslexia cannot be diagnosed by most schools. The processing disorder behind the dyslexia is what really matters. I need to know what's happening in your brain, your child's brain's processes, in order for me to be an effective teacher to your child, tutor of your child, educational therapist, whatever you want to call me. In order for me to be effective in helping your child, I need to know what's going on in their brain. The assessments can tell me that. A lot of other things can kind of tell me that too. Just working with kids, you kind of, okay, your working memory is a little low. You can tell a lot. But anyways, that part matters. The official diagnosis does not really matter unless you need it for something. But you do not need it for an IEP. You do not need it for a 504. I don't know what you might need it for, but I'm sure there's something. Send me your questions and your concerns. Kimberlyn@decodinglearningdifferences.com. I can't wait to hear from you. And I will talk to you again next week.